The crash that everyone's talking about right now will be worse than 2008.
Today, American household debt has surpassed $18 trillion. The average American worker has been stuck with wages that haven't kept up with house prices.
The world's biggest economy has run out of money. It cannot even pay its own staff because the US government has shut down.
This is the level of both private debt and government debt in America now. And you can see how private debt was lower than government debt, but rose from 1955 on, a bit of a rise and trough around the 1980s, and finally peaked up at 170% of GDP at the peak of the financial crisis, and then it plunged. This is why I started warning of the financial crisis, the level of private debt compared to GDP and how fast it was changing, and I knew there was a crisis, so I had to warn about it.
Let's talk about the fact that you sort of foresaw the financial crisis coming before other people did. What you can see here is US private debt and government debt, sort of in the 1920s. Private debt gets really high, so it spikes at about 120% of GDP. And then before the 2008 financial crisis, private debt also spikes at around 160% of GDP. Lots of people sort of suggest in the mainstream that it's government debt that causes those crises, but in fact here, government debt was very low, both in 1929 and in 2000. So I suppose, can you explain why you think private debt is what matters more than government debt when it comes to financial crises? What's the mechanism here?
Well, the simplest start of the mechanism is that credit adds to aggregate demand and income. The mainstream will tell you, and you can find Ben Bernanke saying this incessantly, that private credit has no impact upon the macroeconomy. So if you want to find it, turn to page 24 of his essays on the Great Depression, and you'll find him saying there, rejecting Irving Fisher's explanation of what caused the Great Depression. Irving Fisher said it was a debt deflation. And what he says there, the general attitude of the economics discipline was changes in private debt should have no significant macroeconomic effects. Now that comes out of their model in which they treat banks as being just intermediaries that enable Steve to lend to Michael or vice versa. And what happens if I lend to you, my money account goes down, your account goes up. If you repay me, your account goes down, mine goes up. There's no change in the aggregate amount of money. So the change in debt that occurred, whether it's increasing or decreasing, call that credit, has no effect on the macroeconomy. That's a myth. Okay? And this is why I say it's so important to know that banks do the lending. So if a bank lends you money, its asset goes up, your deposit account, your asset goes up as well. And you don't borrow for the sheer pleasure of being in debt. You borrow to spend. So when you then spend that money, your spending includes the money that was originally in your account, and that turns over, plus the change in your account caused by the change in debt. So credit in the world in which banks create money, which is the world we live in, increases both aggregate demand and aggregate income. And that's when you also look at most of the money that banks create now is to buy assets. They don't finance working capital for corporations, unfortunately. They've got caught up in a speculative mania that characterizes the last 50 years. The main way that credit now goes is rather than going into, working capital for corporations to build new machines and so on, it goes to buy houses, and that directly drives up house prices. So credit is part of aggregate demand and aggregate income, and it's the predominant form of purchasing that buys assets. So that's the reason that I saw the financial crisis coming. And it's the reason that the neoclassicals did not see the financial crisis coming, because the mental model they have about what banks do is that banks just enable, as I said in that example, Stephen to lend to Michael or vice versa. And if one repays the other, there's no change in the total level of demand. The only macroeconomic effect is going to come out of differences in how fast I spend versus how fast Michael spends. Fairly trivial, you can leave that out of your analysis. That is completely wrong in the world in which we live, in which banks actually create money. So I want to show what that turns up in the empirical data, because this is why I started warning of the financial crisis starting in December of 2005, when after quite a lag for a number of years I hadn't looked at that data, I suddenly saw the level of private debt compared to GDP and how fast it was changing, and I knew there was a crisis, so I had to warn about it. And by the way, if you want to use my proprietary software Ravel for economic analysis too, you get it as a free bonus inside my 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge, like over 600 people have already done. To learn more, apply at stevekeen.com. This is the level of both private debt and government debt in America now. I'll show the UK later, and you can see how private debt was lower than government debt, but rose from 1955 on, a bit of a rise and trough around the 1980s, and finally peaked up at 170% of GDP at the peak of the financial crisis, and then it plunged. The reason this has economic impact is that people use borrowed money and buy both goods and services and assets with that money, and therefore the change in debt is part of both aggregate demand and aggregate income, and it affects both economic activity in terms of GDP. It also affects asset prices. So when you take a look at the annual change in private debt here and compare that to the unemployment rate for America over the period from 1955 to now, you get very strong correlation. When credit goes up, unemployment goes down, and vice versa. And if you focus in and look at the period specifically around the financial crisis, so if I narrow down to look at 1990 roughly to 2012, we'll do there, and take a look at that correlation. It goes from fairly strong, minus 0.4, to ludicrously high, minus 0.93. Economists would probably kill to get a correlation anywhere near that level for their models. This is not a model, it's just my intuition informed by Minsky's financial instability hypothesis about the role of credit in driving aggregate demand and income. And the data confirms it off the scale in terms of those correlations. To me, this is one of the most annoying elements of being who I am, that these correlations are ludicrously high. I don't care if anybody comes at me with a correlation isn't causation argument. A correlation this high, you have to give explanation as to why it happens. My explanation, which is causal, is it's the role of private banks in creating money, which increases the amount of money in circulation. And because people borrow to spend, they don't borrow to remain in debt, as I facetiously said in that interview. They borrow to spend. That becomes part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. So this chart here, the rising level of private debt, that's what led me to make my claims about a crisis coming before the crisis occurred. Now, neoclassical economists do not even look at this data. But of course, after the crisis, they heard about people like me saying credit is part of aggregate demand and income, therefore the level of credit matters. And they dismissed it. Ironically, the way they dismissed it shows they haven't got a clue what they're talking about, because here's a paper from a leading neoclassical, Leo Hanian, and here's the title of the paper, The Economic Crisis from a Neoclassical Perspective. I want to focus on how they attacked the arguments of people like myself that it was the level of private debt and the rate of growth of private debt that caused the crisis. So here's a chart using data from the Federal Reserve and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Take a look at the numbers first of all. Bank credit to GDP was 1.2 back in 1978, and then it reached 1.9 around the time of the crisis, and then it's come down on the other side. And this is the period of the Great Recession, as Americans call it, the global financial crisis, as the rest of the world calls it. And you notice that the level of what they're calling credit here goes from about 1.9 up to 2 and back down to 1.9 again. Now, just to show how ignorant neoclassical economists are of the role of credit in the economy, they mistook what's being called credit here for credit. It's a labeling issue, because a lot of databases, and this is the case with the Federal Reserve System, would ascribe the level of debt as credit, and that's what's happened here. Now, debt is the amount of money you owe. Credit is the change in the amount of money you owe over time. Obviously, the level does not determine your buying power. It's the change in debt that gives you more or less buying power over time. So this is not credit, as accountants would call it. This is debt. But have a look at the argument this economist makes here. The financial explanation also argues that the recession became much worse because of a significant contraction in intermediation services. What does that mean? That's debt, okay? That's change in debt, pardon me. That's what banks actually do. In their mental model, they ignore all the practical arguments that the Bank of England's made and I've made and so many non-orthodox economists have made over time, that bank lending creates money. They say, no, banks are just intermediators. Banks enable Stephen to lend to Michael. So what they do is not actually lending, it's intermediation services. They introduce Steve to Michael and the change can occur. That's nonsense. Okay? Banks create money. It's banks that do the lending, but they call it intermediation. Now they say, but some measures of intermediation intermediation have not declined substantially. Figure 4, which is taken from an academic paper and updated for this one, shows that bank credit relative to nominal GDP rose at the end of 2008 to an all-time high. That's what's up here. And while this declined by the first quarter of 2010, so we're now talking here, bank credit was still at a higher level at this point than any time before 2008. And similarly, flow of funds data shows that the borrowing levels of households are virtually unchanged since 2007. These data suggest that aggregate quantities of intermediation volumes have not declined markedly. This, as I said, is a leading neoclassical economist. It's published in a leading neoclassical journal. This is the leading economic journal. And of course, this had to be refereed. So neoclassical economists read this paper and approved the arguments that are being shown as relation to this particular graph. Now, these arguments are nonsense because this is not the level of intermediation services. It's the level of debt. It's not the change in debt, which is what they would call intermediation services. So what happens when you take a look at this, not in terms of the ratio of debt to GDP, but the ratio of the change in debt to GDP? And that's what I'm doing in this bottom chart down here. So there's the level of debt, which they mistakenly call credit. This is the actual level of credit, which is the change in private debt per year divided by GDP. And rather than having no significant effect, the correlation between change in the level of private debt as a percentage of GDP and the unemployment rate is minus 0.93. That is so far off the scale. That's the sort of correlation that scientists would be disappointed by, but economists would be ecstatic to achieve. This comes out of the data. You can only see it by seeing, from my point of view, where credit is part of aggregate demand and income. Now, I first worked this analysis out when I built a model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and I've since dramatically improved how I derived that model, but this is now showing that model in several stages. So this is a model of a cyclical economy without debt at this stage. And if I run the model, I get cycles in the employment rate, cycles in wages share, and so on. This alone puts me outside the neoclassical world because neoclassicals think in terms of equilibrium all the time. So far as they're concerned, cycles are caused by exogenous shocks. Nonsense. They're part of the endogenous nature of the economy. So this is a system which cycles up and down. It'll continue cycling. There's no particular direction, but it's a cyclical system. Now, what if I add debt in the system and say that firms borrow money to invest during a boom and they try to repay that debt during a slump? What happens with that system? And this is what I did back in my PhD thesis back in 1992. And rather than the closed cycles you saw beforehand, you can see that we're now moving, the cycles become different over time. And notice the cycles are getting smaller. And if you're neoclassical, you'd make the mistake of thinking, oh, we're headed towards equilibrium. This is going to reach equilibrium and everything's going to be hunky-dory. No, it's not. This is a live, dynamic, complex systems model. The cycles that started to diminish start to get larger again. This is starting to happen now. Looking at various elements of the system, this is the profit rate versus the debt level. And you can see the profit rate, the cycles in profit bounce around an equilibrium level. Not so lucky for the workers. The increasing level of private debt, which is debt being borrowed by firms in this instance, doesn't affect the rate of profit until the whole system falls apart, but it causes workers to have a lower share of GDP. So this is the way in which these dynamics actually affect the distribution of income as well. If you run this model for long enough, you get the level of debt overwhelming the economy and you collapse into a debt deflation. And that's what I'm trying to warn against by saying let private debt get too large. It's the same thing Irving Fisher warned about in the Great Depression, saying that's what actually caused the Great Depression. We should have learnt about this as something that we want to prevent. We didn't, courtesy of mainstream economists. So they don't actually see what's going on. What I've shown so far is empirical data showing that credit causes changes in macroeconomic activity. So that's the empirical argument. This is a mathematical model showing the same outcome. What I want to now show is the logic behind why credit is part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. And this is going to get complicated, I'm sorry. To actually explain what's going on, you need to understand this complication. What I have here is a way of looking at how aggregate demand is affected by what the banking sector does. And what I've done with the banking sector, I've divided all the customers of the banking sector into three sectors: the household sector, the services sector, and manufacturing. And I then have all the transactions are happening through bank accounts. So any spending you do, you transfer money from your bank account to the other sector's bank account. And because I'm looking at expenditure across this row, if I have a household spending, say $8 per year on the services sector, then the amount of money in the household sector goes down by $8 per year and the amount in the services go up. If I include spending by the household sector on manufacturing, then the account goes down by $B per year and the account in the manufacturing sector goes up by $B per year. So every row has to sum to zero. And what you can see that minus A minus B comes out of households, A plus B goes into services and manufacturing, that line sums to zero. Here's expenditure by the services sector, that line sums to zero. Here's expenditure by manufacturing. And the negative of the sum across the diagonal will be aggregate expenditure. The sum of the off-diagonal elements is aggregate income. They are necessarily the same. So the only thing that all economists agree upon, whether they're Marxist at one extreme or Austrian at the other, aggregate expenditure is aggregate income. Any argument you make must obey that conservation rule. So here is looking at the way that neoclassical economists think about banks doing what they call intermediation services rather than lending. They enable the services sector, in this case, to lend to the household sector. So that means that the services sector can spend less on manufacturing than it could beforehand, but the household sector can spend more on manufacturing. And then, of course, the reason that services sector is lending to the household sector is because they can charge interest on the outstanding debt. So as well as having buying goods and services, the household sector now has to pay interest dollars per year to the services sector. Now, when you work out the negative of the sum of the diagonals, which is aggregate expenditure, or the sum of the off-diagonals, which is aggregate income, you find that credit cancels out because you have this is actually a positive entry for credit. You've got minus credit, that's plus credit there. Here you have minus credit, the two cancel out. Equally, when you look at that's from the expenditure point of view, in the model that is in the minds of neoclassical economists, credit cancels out, so you can forget about credit when you model the macroeconomy. Equally, when you look in terms of income, the income for the manufacturing sector includes plus credit dollars per year from the household sector and minus credit dollars per year from the services sector, therefore they cancel out as well. So credit is not part of aggregate demand and income in the loanable funds model, but interest payments are, because interest occurs only once on the diagonal, which is where it's coming out of expenditure, once on the off diagonal, where it represents income. So in loanable funds, interest payments are part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. Credit is not part of aggregate expenditure and aggregate income. Now, the real world. Let's take a look at the real world. Wouldn't that be exciting for economists? Look at the real world. This now has the banks do the loan. So the bank puts credit dollars per year into the household's bank account by giving a loan to the household, so the liabilities of the household sector have risen, but so has their potential spending power. Now, as I mentioned earlier, nobody borrows for the sheer pleasure of remaining in debt. So your borrowing is to spend, and you therefore spend credit dollars per year on the manufacturing sector. Now, take a look at the number of entries here. Credit occurs once on the diagonal, so it adds to aggregate expenditure, and once on the off-diagonal, so it adds to aggregate income. Therefore, credit is part of aggregate demand and income in the real world, and because neoclassical economists prefer to stick with this fictional model, where credit doesn't add to aggregate demand and aggregate income, that's why they didn't see the financial crisis coming, and it leads to absurdities like this neoclassical economist here mistaking debt for credit. Now, even the numbers should point out there's something seriously wrong here, because look at here, they're saying the ratio of bank credit to GDP is 2. It shows how little attention they're paying to it. If that were true, that means the volume of borrowed money per year would be twice GDP. So if GDP in 2007 was, say, $10 trillion per year, that would mean that the change in private debt was $20 trillion in that year. That's ludicrous. If that were the case, the ratio of debt to GDP would be often the tens of thousands of percent. So it shows they know so little about the banking sector that this verbal mistake by the Federal Reserve of calling debt credit led them to think that credit was twice GDP per annum. That's never happened. Maybe during Weimar Republic, but it's not the real world. So they simply cannot understand the arguments of people like myself that say that credit matter because they don't know what credit is in the very first place. So it isn't just Ahani who made this mistake. He made it. The referees who read the paper and approved it for publication made it. The editor made it. This shows how ignorant neoclassical economists are in general on what the banking sector does in capitalism. And if you're ignorant about the banking sector in capitalism, you're ignorant about capitalism, period. This is why neoclassical economics has to go.
Like many other truth seekers, I want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks. You'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to stevekeen.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to stevekeen.com to apply as well for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.